You know what's interesting, Galveston? I've just been reading an article about Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Yeah, it was said to be one of the greatest horror movies of all time, and I just don't agree. Yeah, I don't know. I think for me it's just like a really overrated movie. And talk about not scary. Anyway, today on Jack Horrorhound's House of Horrors, we're going to discuss the 5 main reasons I think that Stanley Kubrick's The Shining isn't a very good horror movie. So, many people have argued that Stanley Kubrick's interpretation of the character of Jack Torrance as a sort of overtly menacing character straight from the off, you know, as opposed to him slowly unravelling his kind of protagonistic kind of characteristics, really undermines the complexity of Stephen King's original novel. And that's something I actually happen to agree with. One of the weirdest things about Stanley Kubrick's The Shining is that the portrayal of Jack Torrance is straight from the bat, you don't trust this guy. Straight from the off, he's a little off. And Jack Nicholson is basically just playing a send-up version of himself. I think one of the worst things that Stanley Kubrick did in this movie was let Jack Nicholson take full ownership of Jack Torrance, the character. And I think that in Stephen King's novel, the interesting thing about the story, because the story is primarily about Jack Torrance, the father, that at the beginning of the story, Jack Torrance's character has, you know, he's pulled himself back from the brink of alcoholism, and he's kind of trying to fix his lost ways and amend a relationship with his son and his wife. And the tragedy of this story is that obviously we see that Jack inevitably falls back off the wagon, and it's a tragic tale of paradise lost almost. And in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, it completely circumvents all of that, and to me, to the detriment of the movie. As well as all that, I think that Stanley Kubrick's The Shining also deters a lot from the supernatural kind of horror of the story. The whole film is about ghosts, spirits, overtaking a mortal man's mind and twisting it and bending it. And a lot of that is actually missing from this movie. It's just not there. And not to mention, you don't even get to see the hedge mage animals, which, you know, one of my favourite things. Animal made out of leaves. But also the backstory to their hotel. There's so much missing that came from the original source material that just wasn't included in the movie. And in my book, it needs to be in there. This film could have been epic. It could have been this great character study about how a man is overtaken by both the ghosts of his past, but also the literal ghosts of the hotel. And Stanley Kubrick just doesn't get there for me. And I think it's a real shame. It's a real missed opportunity. For this one, I actually get a lot of flack. So I have friends that love this movie, and I know a lot of people out there absolutely adore this film. My argument is simply that it's not a good horror movie. Not that it's not a good film, not that there's not some great things to say about it. Ultimately, it is a Stanley Kubrick film, and that comes with, you know, a certain amount of quality. I mean, it's just undeniable. But it's not a good horror film in my interpretation. I think one of the worst things that's kind of really bigged up in this movie that I think is a massive mistake is atmosphere. I've been told by horror fans that this is one of the most atmospheric films going, and I think when people do that, what they're actually saying is that the setting of this movie is really cool, which I totally agree with. The hotel and the setting of this movie is fantastic, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's got great atmosphere. And in my opinion, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining doesn't have a good atmosphere.
How can you say that, Jack?
Well, listen, if you just calm down a second, I'll tell...
No, how dare you! Are you trying to say that The Thing doesn't have a good atmosphere? That was set in snow!
No, I know, but there's more to a film than just the setting of where it's at. You know, it's just physically there, but, you know, there's more to building up an atmosphere.
Right, me and you were having fisticuffs!
Nobody uses that phrase anymore, Guy. It's gonna be okay. Okay, so this next segment is all about the score of The Shining. Now, for me... this is a hit and miss thing. Some aspects of The Shining score are absolutely awesome, and some of it is absolute garbage in my personal opinion. It's crazy, the kind of juxtaposition between the different aspects of the score, namely because at least 4 people worked on it. The 2 primary composers were Wendy Carlos and Rachel Alkind. with a couple of other composers thrown into the mix. So it was a big amalgamation of different things. I mean, it starts with this really cool aerial shot as we're following the car up the mountainside to get to the Overlook Hotel. And over the top of that, instead of this kind of, I don't know, this subtle building of tension and this kind of creepy dread, what we get is wow, 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 wow. And I just throw my hands up in the air. Again, a lot of this is my personal opinion. It's just kind of, I guess, my gut reaction to this movie, but I just don't get it. I'm just like, what is this? But there are other sections of the movie where the score is completely on point. I mean, there's the bits where Danny's kind of cycling down the corridors, and there's just like, again, this very subtle, kind of background music. The score just really drops down. And again, it's where it should be. It's this kind of creeping dread, what's around the next corner, and it really puts you on edge. But for me, it's the consistency of the score. As I say, in some aspects of the movie, it's completely out of nowhere, very bombastic, very kind of loud and kind of overstated. And in other parts of the movie, it's absolutely fine and perfect. But for me, again, with all the other issues that I have with this movie, the score really doesn't help. Okay, for this segment, we're going to be talking about the acting of the movie. Now, this is where people are probably going to get the most upset with me on this one. But for me, the acting in this movie is not great. So this is one of, I think it's fair to say, Jack Nicholson's breakout performances. And again, he does a great job from one point of view. Like, Jack Nicholson is essentially just playing up a large send-up of himself. And I think he was, for the most part, left to his own devices in terms of his direction and how he was going to perform the character of Jack Torrance. And I think it really shows in this movie. That's not to mention the actress of Shelley Duvall and her performance of this kind of whinging, nagging, being scared, being timid, being frightened, is basically just consistent throughout the movie, and again lacks a lot of nuance. You know, I'd like to explore her character a bit more, and we don't get it. The other thing I don't like about the acting within The Shining is the facial expressions. I do not understand the facial expressions in this movie. Maybe it's just me, you guys let me know, but a lot of the close-ups of Danny Torrance's face when he's seeing the ghosts is so over the top, so cartoonish, it rips me right out of the film. The last shot where Jack Torrance is frozen in the ice, spoiler alert, when he's frozen there and he's literally cross-eyed with his mouth open. I was looking around when I first saw this movie like, is this film a prank? Am I being trolled? It was absolutely ridiculous and the most unscary thing I've ever seen in terms of an acting performance. Very strange, very weird, over-the-top, cartoonish facial expressions. So again, it's another film of kind of two different halves, two extremes. Really laid back, almost non-acting in some certain sequences, certain things that I guess aren't anything to do with the hotel or the ghosts. And then everything else is just massively overacted and without depth. And for me, it's one of the biggest problems about the movie overall. So, for me, this film just isn't scary. And I'm going to say that right up front. It's just not scary. And that is probably the film's, I'd say, one of its biggest sins, ultimately. Because it was marketed, and it's probably due to marketing, if anything else. It's probably their fault, really. But it was marketed as one of the scariest films ever made. One of the best horror movies. It's constantly up in the top 5 in all the kind of, like, online, you know, kind of polls and things like that. And I think that, for me, is the detriment to the film. Because this film is not scary. So a lot of the kind of gore sequences, anything to do with the ghosts or gore or monsters is literally flashed on the screen, almost in like a still image. The two twin girls, for example, and their deaths and massacre and all that, it's literally just flashed on the screen. The famous blood elevator sequence isn't really joined in with any narrative, it just kind of happens. And it has no effect on any of the characters. There's no consequences to that thing happening. It doesn't kind of wash over one of the characters and they get completely covered in blood. No, literally, I think it's Shelley Duvall's character goes around the corner, sees it, and that's it. It just kind of happens. But don't get me wrong, there are some sequences in the movie that build a sense of unease. There is some tensions between certain characters at certain points. To me, it just doesn't last long enough, and there isn't a kind of consistent narrative thrust behind any of the tension/horror. There are little pieces of scary things and bits like that. The twins in the corridor, that's freaky. That's a bit like, oh, that's unsettling, that's not great. But it doesn't kind of go with anything else. So for me, this film just really does fall flat and ultimately isn't a scary film. And for one of the scariest films ever made, that's a real problem for me. And so there you go. That's the 5 main reasons why I don't think Stanley Kubrick's The Shining is a good horror movie, a good horror film. Now, if you guys disagree or agree, please let us know. Give us your comments, your feedback. Maybe you've got some counterpoints. Maybe you can explain some of this stuff to me. Maybe I'm just not thinking about it right, or I'm coming at it from the wrong kind of perspective. You guys let me know. I really want to hear from you. Leave a comment down below. Contact us on our social media, Instagram, Twitter, etc. All the information is down below. We really want to hear from you. Let us know if you like Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. But until next time, guys, stay safe, stay scared, and yeah, we'll speak to you soon. Bye.